ignore it. The last two live streams, we said that this error message, something went wrong, is just like an SCA false positive. It's like check engine light. Something's wrong. You don't know what.
Just keep pushing.
Chris, thank you for joining me on the Friday live stream.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here, man. It's always great to have these kind of live, fluid discussions rather than, pre-scripted kind of stuff that's not as fun.
Yeah, whenever a new compliance regulation drops or there's a new RFC, we pick up the red phone. We call Chris to tell us what the hell's going on. So you maybe start by just talking a little bit about the work that you do day to day, in the interest of who Chris is and why should we trust him when he talks about government compliance.
Yeah, so by way of background, I've spent most of my 20-ish years of IT cyber work in the public sector. Spent time in the U.S. military, U.S. Air Force, and then as a government employee at a program named FedRAMP, and now own a consulting company. You're working with various federal agencies, on the federal surveillance side, Department of Defense side, that kind of thing. So just living and breathing, those federal compliance and cybersecurity requirements for quite some time, including FedRAMP and navigating that, and deep in the weeds of vulnerability management and cloud security and all those kind of topics. So hopefully it gives me some credibility on these things.
Yeah, so the thing specifically that we wanted to talk about today is this new RFC that came out from FedRAMP, but maybe we can zoom out just a little bit and you can give us a brief overview of what FedRAMP is and who is it for?
Yeah, so FedRAMP, essentially, when you think about going to the federal market and trying to sell a product or software, for example, most software today is typically as a SaaS, not all of it, of course, but software as a service. FedRAMP is a framework that the government uses to assess, and authorize cloud native services. It could be IaaS, PaaS, SaaS, you name it, for federal consumption. So you say you're selling to, the VA, the Health and Human Services, Department of Defense, whomever, right? They're typically required to use and procure, software and cloud services that have been FedRAMP authorized, as they call it. So FedRAMP has a robust process, that you go through to get assessed and authorized. You have to meet many different security controls, in the hundreds of controls, depending on the level that you're going for. They have a low, moderate, and high baseline of security controls. They're all derived from NIST 853, in terms of security control catalog. So anything you're doing or selling to the government around, software, especially if you're a SaaS provider, for example, you're going to have to meet FedRAMP. You've run into FedRAMP. And those requirements now have even, move beyond the agencies themselves. If you're in the defense industrial base, for example, or you're a company doing services work for the federal government, which there's thousands of those as well, you must be using cloud services that are authorized through FedRAMP. So it has a wide reach, and it's often viewed, there's a lot of compliance frameworks out there, SOC 2, HIPAA, HITRUST, you name it, right? FedRAMP is one of many, but it's often viewed as kind of a gold standard when you think about cloud security and compliance. So I hope that's a good primer for folks not familiar with FedRAMP.
Yeah, so kind of like other standards, do you find that companies outside of the federal space adopt some of these things? Do you find that something that becomes standard with FedRAMP then translates to as almost like a North Star for the rest of the industry?
Yeah, I definitely do. And, again, there's others out there like SOC 2 and so on, but I do a lot of consulting through other organizations outside of my own too, and advisory work. And FedRAMP is often cited, by large organizations, whether you're thinking like banking, financial, regulated industries, even in tech. FedRAMP is a widely known and cited and used framework when we think about cloud security and compliance, even beyond the government space. It's just highly respected. If it's a lot of folks think of it from the perspective, if this is secure and good enough for the government, right, it's probably a good thing for us to orient around as well. So it has a lot of adoption just well beyond U.S. government as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about this new RFC. Can you give us the overview of what's the shakeup? What are people nervous about? What is it?
Yeah, so just again to step back and kind of give a primer, FedRAMP, it's not without its issues, right? So people have been raising challenges of going through the FedRAMP process. It's time consuming, it's costly, it's cumbersome, you name it, everything that we love about compliance in general. But FedRAMP is on this effort right now called FedRAMP 20X. And as part of that, their program management office, their leadership is out there trying to engage with the community, make improvements to the program, whether it's their policy and process, how they can help industry, get through the process easier, how they can align with best practices. is, which brings us to the kind of the topic of today, which is this RFC 002. It's called FedRAMP Continuous Vulnerability Management Standard. And they released this just recently this week. Again, this is not finalized yet. They're taking comment from industry, whether via GitHub or email, those kind of things, feedback from industry. But the overall, they summarize it as this. I'll kind of read it verbatim here. It says this proposed continuous vulnerability management standard indicates an intended direction for FedRAMP, and it deals with organizations being able to promptly detect and respond to critical vulnerabilities by considering the entire context over CVSS risk scores alone, prioritizing realistically exploitable weaknesses and encouraging automated vulnerability management. So this is kind of the primer on what they're trying to do here. Is that piece that jumps out to me and probably should jump out to everyone is typical compliance frameworks like FedRAMP oriented around CVSS base scores. And many people are very familiar with CVSS, but the problem there again is that we have tens of thousands of CVEs every year. Those base scores are not really reflective of your organization, or things like known exploitation, exploitation probability, reachability, some of the things we'll talk about in a moment. So you end up spending an inordinate amount of time, having development teams, engineers fixing things that may not even be a risk, whether due to, compensating and mitigating controls that you have in place, or the CVE is not even exploited. It's not likely to be exploited. It's not reachable, you name it. So this is a good signal to the industry that, one of the largest, most respected compliance frameworks out there for cloud security and compliance is now oriented around context that we're talking about here. And this is a message I know we've been kind of beating this drum at Endor for some time, but it's great to see kind of this validation from such an industry leader like FedRAMP, for example.
Yeah. So I think the key word there is context, right? Where it says, show me things that are actually exploitable, but does it define more specifically what that means to them? If that means function reachable, if that means, direct or transitive dependencies, EPSS, CVSS, is there a risk profile that they offer? Because I've heard you maybe not criticize, but offer feedback before about some of these standards where they go almost far enough to tell you what you need to do, but they never provide you the specifics about, hey, this is what it means to address a vulnerability, or this is the risk profile that an auditor will be happy with. So is there any guidance about those in there?
It is to some extent. Again, it's not perfect. In compliance, I like to say it's kind of a blunt instrument. It's very hard for these frameworks. Like you can even take a topic like reachability, right? And people will we have strong opinions in security. It's static versus runtime, what type of, transitive versus direct dependencies, you name it, right? So it's a bit of a blunt instrument, but they do go on to talk about credibly exploited vulnerabilities is the way they kind of frame it within here. And they talk about things like, of course, like, whether something is, internet accessible and reachable, but they also want organizations to provide reports that show, they call it an exploitability assessment. Is it credibly exploitable? And we've seen, some traction of this. If I'm not mistaken, Endor even has a blog out there where they collaborate with a 3PAO on reachability, right? As kind of part of creating POAMs, they call them, for findings that can't be fixed or don't need to be fixed for particular reasons. And when they say credibly exploitable, it does go on to discuss things like, the context of if it's known to be exploited, perhaps if there's exploitation evidence, for EPSS would be a good example. They don't cite EPSS by name, but when I think of exploitability in the context of how they're discussing it here, they're not necessarily saying any particular type of reachability or what level of, dependencies. They don't get too granular, but it shows you again the direction that they're headed. Again, is not just CVSS base scores, but the context of the vulnerability. When we think about things, they say criticality, reachability. So they do say reachability by name, exploitability. So things like that are something they're calling out directly, and it's really good. Again, that compliance typically lags industry best practices, and this is an example of that. But it is refreshing to see them having this in there. When you talk about reachability, well, clearly they're talking about reachability analysis. So if you can go and work with your assessor, your third-party assessment organization, the FedRAMP PMO, the agencies that you're working with, and explain like, hey, this isn't a finding because it's not reachable, for example, or it isn't known to be exploited or likely to be exploited. I think this is going to open the door to help teams, going through these compliance processes really narrow down, significantly. Like, we've seen studies, it's 92% roughly on average of just just the noise that you're spending time trying to fix things. So really narrowing that down to what really matters and what poses a risk to not just the cloud service provider or software vendor in this case, but the agencies that are using these services too.
What kind of SLAs are they asking for here?
Yeah, this was an interesting one and something I'll be discussing in an article that I'll have come out here soon. So they provide a quick reference. It's a table in here and it says vulnerability response timeframes. So we'll kind of walk through these a little bit. They have three categories first, which is those credibly exploitable vulnerabilities as they frame them. And they talk about reachable, and they talk about internet reachable, not internet reachable, and then again, not internet reachable, but where you have some compensating controls in place, for example. And then the last category is all detected vulnerabilities. And so just to walk through those a little bit, if it's credibly exploitable, it's internet reachable, it needs to be remediated in 3 days. If it's credibly exploitable, it's not internet reachable. It needs to be remediated, sorry, in 7 days. And last, but credibly exploitable vulnerabilities that are not internet reachable and have an impact of low, for example, need to have a remediation timeline of 21 days. And then last but not least, the final catch-all kind of category is all detected vulnerabilities need to be fully mitigated or remediated within 6 months. And when you look at these, it seems easy, right? If you're not in security or you're not kind of deep in the weeds, to say, oh, well, yeah, just, patch it, right? 3 days, 7 days, 21 days, 6 months, just patch it. But as I talk about in this article I have coming out, the organizational remediation capacity is not great, right? I forget the exact figures. Let me pull them up here on the side, but it's like half of all vulnerabilities are open after, 6 months, I want to say. And then let me actually pull up my exact figures here so I can show you. I'll dive into that here. So give me a minute. Let's dive into a different question just while I pull this up.
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because we have a product at Endor Labs called Endor Patches that it's essentially backported security patches. So if you're using, you're on some version of Spring or you're on Jackson Databind, you have a vulnerability that if you intend to upgrade it, it will send you into months and months of refactoring. And that is almost the piece that this doesn't take into account, where it says, yeah, just fix everything in 6 months. You couldn't possibly fix everything in 6 months unless, we come out with some crazy new AI refactoring wizard. But that's why patches have become popular, because then you can stay on the version that you're on, fix the critical vulnerabilities, you stay compliant while you plan your longer term upgrade. But in many cases, even that upgrade is not viable. We've had customers, mostly very large organizations, where they would invest millions of dollars in a team that essentially maintains a certain package that has become so core to the business. And you can't simply upgrade it, right? You can't simply patch it. So I wonder how, like, what's your take on if these SLAs are realistic at all? Like, yeah.
It truly depends, and I want to pull these figures up to make sure I didn't misspeak. But some of the research that I cite and tend to believe and respect is it says 25% of vulnerabilities are remediated within 4 weeks, half of all vulnerabilities are remediated within 100 days, and then more than a quarter of them stay open after a year. And we've seen studies that show vulnerability backlogs for large enterprise organizations getting into hundreds of thousands, even the millions in some cases. So that remediation capacity is just not there. And I hate to give a political answer to your question of like how realistic is this, but it really depends. How complex is your architecture? How much software are you running? What's the technical talent of your team? Are you a startup that's bootstrapped, just trying to get to go to market, for example, or are you a large enterprise team with a large cybersecurity support staff that's highly technical and talented, and you have security baked into your SDLC? It depends, and that's why I think things that you're talking about, like Endor patches, for example, is critical. One is it lets people lean into that in terms of kind of a managed service to let you apply the fix without disrupting the business. We think about the CIA triad, for example. The A is for availability. Like the worst thing you want to do from security's perspective is interrupt that availability. So being able to apply that fix to meet these SLAs while also not being viewed as a blocker, right? From your development team, engineering peers, that they view us as a blocker, as adding friction. That's critical. But also just having automated capabilities in place to where you can perform a scan, right? And look at things like exploitability, reachability, so that you can start to meet these SLAs. Because if you're just using legacy security tools that don't really provide that kind of context, again, that context word coming into play here, you're not going to be able to make sense of the noise and know, okay, what do I really need to fix within 3, 7, 21 days, or even 6 months? It's just going to overwhelm you. You need that context to kind of make these decisions and meet these SLAs.
And so, according to this, when they say all vulnerabilities, that's what I just get so hung up on. If Are we still talking about all vulnerabilities above a certain threshold of criticality and exploitability? It does not mean that I have a medium severity, unreachable test scope type of vulnerability. It does not mean that I have to scramble to go and fix that, right?
Well, that's what's interesting. If you read this, they have this table in here. They talk about reachability, they talk about impact, and it literally says, it goes from very high, high, moderate, low, and all. So they're saying all, which is interesting because as you said, like it may not be exploitable, be in production. You name it, right? There's all these kind of factors that come into play. Environments as well, or they can chain together multiple, kind of moderate or lower level vulnerabilities and attack those. So it's someone will make that case somewhere that you need to address all vulnerabilities, regardless of the impact or exploitability, reachability, etc.
So how does the RFC process work? Like, is this now part of the standard, or is now will this has to jump through more hoops?
That's correct. Yeah, it's going to go through, they have a section here where they talk about that. It's going to go through this public comment period, essentially. It says this, it's not going to be used in its draft form currently. They're going to take these, comments from the public and integrate them into the standard, and then they'll roll it out in kind of a phased approach. Some to initial pilot, users and collaborators that they have for the FedRAMP 20X program, and then eventually moving towards the entire kind of FedRAMP scope of systems that are within the FedRAMP authorization kind of scope. So it is a tiered process. There'll be kind of a rollout of this. But again, I would strongly encourage people to get in there and leave these comments when we think about things of the nuances of reachability or exploitability, or like your point, it's a dev environment, it's a test environment, et cetera. Trying to provide that feedback, because that's still going to have a disproportionate impact on the community if we don't get that kind of nuance. But it's so hard to it's so hard to have a framework that's so widely applicable and can be used by so many, but have that level of nuance too. And that's kind of the difficulty of creating these kind of things.
So, and what about existing backlogs, right? Like you're still working your way through a backlog of vulnerabilities that you're prioritizing. You have AI generated code that's creating 10x more code. We just saw this interesting thing about because a lot of the LLMs that create AI generated code are trained on code that is at least a year old, but a lot of the CVs that get published every day are novel. You talked about this in the write-up that you did on the Endor blog a little bit ago. So your backlog is not just getting bigger; it's getting exponentially bigger. Does this take any of that into account, or is that something that people are freaking out over?
I think it's something that people are concerned about because it applies to existing vulnerabilities, but it may be helpful in some cases because the way the standard is now, there is no nuance around exploitability, reachability, those kind of things. So this could be a method to kind of burn down that backlog in a strategic way, where before you just had to meet the kind of blunt instrument guidance that was out there, where it didn't take into fact the context of reachability, exploitability, those kind of factors as well. So I think that is promising. But to your point, the AI is it's a double-edged sword, right? It's a quote unquote productivity booster, but we see more code. The code is, of course, these models are trained on open source, that's out there that has pervasive vulnerabilities as well. So it's going to have vulnerabilities associated with it. And then your point as well is, some of the software, for example, may be a bit older, but the CVEs may be newer. So there's a correlation between the CVE identifier and the software itself that's not perfect as well. So it's a yes and no. In some ways, I think you have an opportunity to kind of burn down the backlog, focusing on these contexts that they're talking about here. But on the other hand, it's not like the development teams are stopping in the meantime. They're producing more products, rolling out out new versions, more and more software, more lines of code through AI generated code and copilots and coding assistants and things of that nature. So it's going to be tough no matter what.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, one of the most striking things to me is what you talked about, the gap between policy and practice on how long it actually takes to remediate. You have this quote from the Cynthia Institute on how long vulnerabilities actually stay open. I think that is what we were talking about earlier about the 4 week, 100-day, 1 year remediation percentages. So I think that that is probably where a lot of this is gonna live or die, right? Like, are you able to actually remediate within that time frame? So,
Yeah.
yeah,
I was going to say a couple things. One is, there is the path within the FedRAMP program. They have what's called POAMs, or plans of actions and milestones. Think of those as like residual risks that you couldn't remediate, but you have a plan to, and you can provide timelines on how you'll do that. So you're not completely doomed. There is a path to kind of capture that residual risk and provide a plan to tackle it. And then one thing I thought was both good and kind of bad. Within this opening section of the RFC, it says, once the RFC phase is completed, a modified version informed by public comment will be tested and evaluated with volunteer CSPs. And then it also says, FedRAMP now works with the community to understand the impact of its policies and adjust them based on real world experiences. So it's like, wait, previously, like, you weren't working with the community and like understanding real world experiences, you were just rolling this out and like, good luck. Like, we don't really care, the nuance of the practitioner perspective or what people are actually experiencing with this. It's just, here's what it is, and have at it. So it's good and bad in the sense, like, I'm not throwing shade at them, but it's like, it's kind of amazing that we weren't already doing that. Like, if you're creating these frameworks, these policies and requirements that impact, thousands of organizations, you're talking tens of billions of dollars of IT spend by the federal government, for example, lots of investment by venture capital, startups, and so on. Like, you should have been communicating with the community and working hand in hand already, but at least it's in there now. That's kind of great to see.
yeah. And so this could be a um, silly question, but FedRAMP specifically, is it only for application development? Are we talking specifically about uh, third-party vulnerabilities, or are we talking about other layers of the applications? Are there other areas in application development that this touches that people need to be aware of?
Yeah, it's not just the application layer. For example, like, you may be a SaaS provider, right? And you may be providing a software. But again, as I mentioned, it applies to PaaS, providers, infrastructure as a service. So AWS, Azure, GCP, all those folks, their underlying infrastructure, those security controls. When you go into those frameworks from FedRAMP, it'll have, kind of things below the application layer too, like the infrastructure, physical security, media protection, things that, if you're a SaaS-based startup that's, producing software for the community, you're probably not even thinking about data center security or physical security and like some of those things, because you've leaned so heavily on the cloud service provider at the IaaS layer, right? To kind of do those things for you, inherit those security controls, and lean into that offering. But yeah, it runs the full gamut of the app layer and everything underneath it as well.
Yeah. Okay. So let's, you do a lot of consulting. You work day in, day out in this. What's you're a company that needs to be FedRAMP compliant or have been FedRAMP compliant up until now, and you're reading this RFC. You're sitting down with the client. What are, two or three things that you should be doing right now?
Yeah, I mean, I talked about this a little bit earlier, but one of the first things I'll be doing is, like, when I think about performing vulnerability management, I'll look at, okay, what kind of tooling do I have? And is that tooling capable of providing this level of context that FedRAMP is talking about? Can I see what is exploitable or known to be exploited, likely to be exploited, reachable, those kind of things as well, to see, okay, am I even capable of having this level of context? Because it's a new requirement, but it's also an opportunity. Now you can really refine your approach to vulnerability management, be more efficient, more effective, and focus on real risks. So you can look at your tooling providers, that you're working with, different AppSec, vendors, et cetera, and see how do they provide this level of capability, this level of context or not. And if not, seek one out that does, obviously. And then two is, like, looking at those SLAs that we talked about earlier. Are we in a position to meet that? And if not, again, what are some things that we can lean into, whether it's, managed services, things from, vendors that can streamline this for us, whether it's, I talked about some of this in the article, but, hardened images, for example, zero CVE based images type stuff like that. Of course, indoor patches, shameless plug there. And then of course, there's also the runtime visibility piece of this. We want to try to shift left, but as to your point, a lot of things are running in production already. What can I kind of tap into to get that runtime visibility as well? So I really think it comes down to like tooling. What do we have in place? Understanding what our backlog looks like. How can we kind of efficiently streamline that backlog and get that burnt down based on these contexts and insights that they're talking about? And then two, how do we kind of prepare to meet these SLAs moving forward?
Yeah, and thinking about the recency of your open source estate, right? If you are several versions behind on a lot of core packages, you probably should be thinking about those strategies earlier rather than later. I don't know. So I asked you earlier about the RFC process. I don't know if there's a timeline in there for when you expect people will have to have a meaningful change done by. I can't imagine that it's starting tomorrow you have to have all of these things, but who knows these days? What do you think?
Yeah, it doesn't exactly say. It says the draft standards released for public comment. It does not apply to FedRAMP authorizations and must not be used in its draft form, but it does kind of lay out how they plan to roll it out. So to your point, it's not going to be tomorrow, but I do think it's going to be sooner than later. The FedRAMP Program Management Office, the folks I talked about earlier, they have been moving quickly with changes and rolling them out to the community. So I personally hope they see this, get this out there sooner than later because it's a much improved approach, and it's something that we've been kind of championing and arguing for in the AppSec and security community for some time now. So I hope they get this rolled out to cloud service providers, software vendors, and so on here soon.
Yeah. Anything you think we missed that people need to know about this, either about FedRAMP in general or this RFC specifically?
Not necessarily missed. I just think, kind of going back to the beginning of the conversation, even if FedRAMP isn't applicable to you now, I think some of the things they're talking about in here that we've kind of, talked about, whether it's open source dependencies, AI generated code, and kind of some of the double-edged sword nature of that in terms of vulnerabilities and more lines of code and so on, as well as some of the deeper context around reachability, exploitability. Like even if you're not using FedRAMP or bound by FedRAMP, I think you should be looking at this as your AppSec program to say, hey, how are we doing AppSec? How are we doing vulnerability management currently? Where can we, find efficiencies and improvements by taking a more innovative approach? It'll be better not only from a risk management perspective, but it'll be a better user experience for your development teams, your engineers, and so on. Maybe they won't dread engaging with security.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's always there's a perspective about these things of does it make the divide worse or is it an opportunity to make it a little bit better? Yeah.
Yeah, I think in this case, when you're talking about, reducing that backlog, really, reducing the number of findings that you're going to simply kind of bring to your development team, your engineering peers, it's likely going to be well received versus, some of the other things we do in security where they're like, oh God, here comes security again. If you're coming and saying, hey, I've actually reduced this backlog of things you need to fix, by 92%, or here, only 8% of these findings now really matter. I need you to focus on this 8%. They'll probably receive that very well, I imagine.
Yeah, and I would imagine that a lot of people will find a way to tie this back to the initiatives to roll out AI generated code and the increased number of vulnerabilities that are being introduced. We have been doing this really great talk about lessons from vibe coding and MCP servers and all of that, where one of the interesting things that we found is that when you do bake security guardrails into that process and you have an up-to-date feed of vulnerability intelligence as you're using a lot of the AI generated code tools, the output is not only more secure, but actually the code is better, more resilient. These guardrails kind of force you to work in little chunks. So I do think that there's an opportunity here for application security teams to be perceived as the enabler for a lot of these things. So and I think you and I had talked about this a while ago on one of the live streams where compliance, like you said, it's a blunt instrument, but it's also the driver for a lot of these things in security. So if you can jump on this as an opportunity to push the things that you already believed in, it certainly kind of aligns with the drum we've been beating at Endor Labs about prioritization, about context, about the the necessity of finding the risk that can actually impact you, and then having real remediation options for it, not just a comment that says, "Hey, yeah, you should upgrade from this version of this version." Maybe everything breaks in the meantime. So we have this line where we say, nobody loves your code like we do. Nobody understands your code like we do. And I think a lot of this is going to come down to having a really deep understanding of how your first party code interacts with everything it depends on, from the containers and open source packages and the AI models. Is there anything in there about the usage of AI models, or not explicitly?
I don't think I saw that in particular. Let me double check. Yeah, I don't think I saw that in particular called out. But I think it's a key piece of this is it's kind of good in my opinion that it's not called out, because I don't want to say code is code. There's obviously nuances to that, but AI is essentially a tool that's helping people produce more code. Whether that's for better or worse remains to be seen. But essentially, it's what gets run in production, what's in your source code. Those are the things that you need to focus on. Whether someone else wrote it directly, it was AI generated, and so on. That's a bit of a nuance, but nonetheless, like vulnerabilities are vulnerabilities, regardless of how they kind of come about.
Yep, great. Well, Chris, I know we're over time. You probably need to go. Thank you so much. And yeah, we have a write up coming from Chris that's going to drop on the Endor blog, and then another one on Resilient Cyber. And yeah, and I'm sure we'll see you on the live stream pretty soon.
Sounds good. Take care.
All right, thank you.